Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Christian Gonzalez, and this is Guilherme Gomez. We are second-year full-time MBA students here at UCLA Anderson and co-presidents of our school's Latin American Business Association. It is with great pleasure that we welcome you all here today for UCLA Anderson's Global Management Speaker Series. Our distinguished speaker is UCLA alumnus and former United States Ambassador to Argentina, Noah Mamet. Ambassador Mamet will present his perspective on U.S. foreign policy and international relations under President Obama and President Trump, with a special emphasis on the new positive bilateral relationship with Argentina. He will also address the business and economic ties between the two countries and opportunities for business and investment in light of the new leadership in each country. Ambassador Noah Mamet, who holds a bachelor's degree in political science from UCLA, served as U.S. Ambassador to Argentina under President Obama, during which bilateral relations between the two countries dramatically improved. Some of the main areas he focused on during his tenure included entrepreneurship, energy, educational exchanges, and climate change.
Following his brief presentation, Ambassador Mamet will be joined by Professor Andres Terech for a moderated conversation. Professor Terech is a native of Argentina and professor of marketing at UCLA Anderson and has taught a number of centers' global immersion courses focused on Latin America. He has accompanied groups of students to Latin America, including Argentina and Peru. We would like to take this opportunity to thank the UCLA Anderson Center for Global Management, the UCLA Latin American Institute, the UCLA Center for Southern Cone Studies, and UCLA Anderson Latin American Business Association for making today's Global Management Speaker Series possible. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Noah Mamet.
Well done. Very nice. Thanks, guys. Thanks for the introduction. It's really fun to be back here. As he said, I graduated a long time ago. In fact, I got here early and drove around, and I said all the parking lots I remember now are buildings. I mean, there's like twice as many buildings 3 times when I was here, but it's a beautiful campus. And I want to just speak for a few minutes, and then we're going to do some Q&A here, but then open it up to Q&A from all of you. So please just feel free, any questions at all. But let me first ask, are there my Argentinos? Any Argentines in here? All right, 1, 2, 3. I know you, Andres. Okay, welcome. Judy, who I think came down with her team about a couple years ago, who, as you know, runs Anderson, and she and I were talking about my experience here at the university and how UCLA, with the chancellor, really wanted to have a bigger presence in Latin America. And I said, well, I'm your guy. I'm going to do everything I can to promote UCLA because I loved my time here. My best friends still came from the university, and I come back a lot. So they've come down, I think, Lucy, 3 or 4 times since. And there's a lot of alumni there. We want more alumni from there. There's going to be 2 more, it sounds like, soon from there. And so I just want to tell you a little bit about my experience. I grew up locally. I grew up in Manhattan Beach, and in high school, actually, I used to drive up across the street. It's Bel Air Country Club. I used to caddy there. And in high school, and then I obviously went to university here and graduated in poli-sci. I loved campaigns and politics even when I was really young, and so I basically went straight into campaigning throughout California, and there was a presidential election. There was a guy named Bill Clinton many years ago in the 1992 election. I went up to Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo. We did that. He won. I went back to Washington and decided I didn't really want to live there. I love this weather. I love Los Angeles. So I wanted to come back, which I did for a few years. Eventually, I sort of broke down. And it's like if you want to go do finance, you got to go to New York. Or if you want to do theater, you go to New York. I felt like if you want to do campaigns and politics, eventually you got to go to Washington. So I did. It was only supposed to be for like 1.5 years. It ended up being like 7, 8 years. And so my boss at the time was Congressman Gephardt from St. Louis, and he ran for president twice in '88. And then again in 2004, and we lost in the primaries to John Kerry. And so, but that gave me the opportunity to move back to LA. And I was always interested in being an entrepreneur. I started my own company when I came here. We did a lot of government affairs, but actually worked for families and companies that really wanted to be involved in the community, both politically and then philanthropically. So we represented family foundations and some companies, a couple you definitely heard of Tesla and SpaceX were two of the bigger companies that we worked for, but others as well. And we did a lot of environmental work and education reform. I sat on the board of Green Dot Public Charter Schools here for 5 years, which is the largest public charter school operator in the country, or it was. So, which was started downtown LA, East LA, and has really expanded. So that was kind of my background. I kept doing campaigns and politics, and then 2012 rolled around, the re-election campaign. I was already involved in working with the White House as a volunteer, helping them promote travel to the United States, travel and tourism, because after 9/11, the US, we lost like a third of market share of travel and tourism to the US, and it's a huge part of the economy, especially here in LA and most of the country. So we did that, working closely with the White House on policy stuff, but also on the campaign, on the re-elect in 2012. I was in Chicago a lot. And then afterward, they asked, would I be interested in being on this long list, to be an ambassador? And I just said, thanks, but no thanks. I live in Marina del Rey. I love it out here. I had never lived overseas permanently. I'd traveled a lot, mostly in Europe and some in Asia, Latin America as well, but not Argentina. And so anyhow, they convinced me. I talked to other ambassadors who were serving, and they all said at one point or another, 2 women and 1 man. They all said, best job I ever had. And they came from the private sector or came from actually academia. So I rethought it and I said, okay, well, let's see where this goes. And one thing, it led to another. It actually worked out. So I went down to Argentina, and Derek, who's in the front row in the white shirt, the tall guy there, worked with me at the embassy and consular affairs. And we can, if you guys are really interested in sort of the jobs within the embassy, happy to talk about that as well. And Derek was one of our real all-stars. And I got to tell you, one of the learning experiences for me was just how patriotic, how amazing our career foreign services officers are, career foreign service officers. Also civil service. So there's kind of different groups. But they move every 3 years to a different country usually that they don't have a lot of control over. It's kind of like the military. So Derek ended up going to Cuba. And after, which is really interesting, in Havana, after Argentina. But people move in every 3 years and they move out, and they take their families and their kids. And again, they don't have a lot of control. And most of them, at one point or another, they either go to Iraq or they go to Afghanistan, they go to Pakistan. I mean, some really tough and dangerous places. So they're the unsung heroes, which one of the reasons, one of the many reasons I am not happy with the Trump administration, which is they came in and unfortunately under Secretary Tillerson, really promoted this idea of a 30% cut across the board. And as it is, these people who worked at the embassy, worked for me, worked nonstop and worked so hard. And I'm really proud of the fact that while Derek was there, in November, over a year ago, so just over a year ago, that month, we in Buenos Aires in Argentina, we issued more visas to travel to the United States than any embassy in the world, any embassy or consulate. That means more than Beijing, more than Guangzhou, more than Mexico City. It's unheard of, and we had way fewer officers, so these guys worked around the clock to get that kind of stuff done. So cutting the State Department is a terrible idea, as did 30 military, our US generals signed a letter to President Trump and the White House saying, don't do this. You want us to fight less wars, keep promoting the State Department and diplomacy. So we had a great run I was there for 2 years and 4 days, but I say, well, who's counting? I left actually on Inauguration Day. This was kind of crazy, Inauguration Day for, going from Obama to Trump. And that last week was really special for me down in Argentina. And we had such a good partnership with President Macri, who's still there, compared to the first year I was there, which was under the previous president, was President Kirchner, Cristina Kirchner, you might have read about. And so we had such a great working partnership with the second government that I worked with. They ended up giving me this award called the Order of San Martin, which is their highest rank. And it was really, they give it to me, but it was really on behalf of the entire embassy, because we were working so closely with them on science and technology and energy, especially renewable energy. Educational exchanges, we can talk about that. We created a new program called Friends of Fulbright. And the first big tranche of students and teachers came to UCLA. They say I had everything to do with it, bringing them to UCLA, which I had a little bit, but it's also because the dean of the education department here at UCLA is Argentine. He had a lot to do with it. And it's just obviously a great school. So we created a program that had 0 students in it when we started, which was a short-term educational exchange program. And I said, called Friends of Fulbright. We went from 0 to about 1,600 students and teachers today, and they're coming to UCLA and Austin and Alabama and Mount Holyoke and a bunch of other places. Because I felt like the best way to combat sort of anti-Americanism, if it existed, I never saw it, but in the polling in Argentina, it tends to be higher than any other country in Latin America for a variety of reasons over the last 100 years. So I said that I thought the best way to deal with that is to get people, Argentines, to have a personal experience in the US and decide for themselves. And so it's great that Fulbright is like 4 years, full ride scholarships, but those are really expensive. A lot of Argentines, for example, do engineering school. That's like, you guys know better than me, it's like $40,000 or $50,000 a year or whatever for 4 years. It's great for that one student, but we were trying to get volume, right? We're trying to get numbers. And so he said, let's do a short-term educational exchange, 2 to 3 months, so we can get many more students. And then their government wanted teachers, too, as a big part of that program. So that was one of the big things that we launched when we were there. And 2 days before I left, I was in the president's office, and the chief of staff showed me polling. And they said, well, look at question number 7 or 8, and it said approval, disapproval of the United States, which is kind of like the key indicator, right, for the country. And we, the U.S., we were at 81% approval rate, which was really unheard of, unprecedented for Argentina or most places around the world. So I felt good about that. We felt good about that at what we did at the embassy. Really, I thought, most of that credit is to the White House and President Obama, but locally, I think we had a pretty big impact. And then I get on the plane, and this is pretty relevant to this last weekend. This woman, this stewardess, came up to me and was talking to me, and she said, "Oh, do you work for the government?" I said, "Well, I did up until a couple hours ago," and I said, and I explained, we had this little election in the U.S., and she laughed and she said, well, and I'm the only person to have left the embassy. Everybody else stays. So we had 330 people. So as a non-career ambassador, I would be the only person to leave. And so she said she's going to march in the Women's March the next day. Again, this was a year ago. I said, what march? I was so focused on Argentina. And she said, well, there's this big march. I've never actually done anything political before in my life, and I'm going to go into Dallas because I had to transfer planes in Dallas. And so I remembered I had this pin on. I took the pin off and gave it to her. And Terech doesn't know this, but there's kind of a book being written about the experience of the last couple of years, and that's the end of it. Because then I got to the hotel, I turned it on because my place is being rented out. I didn't think I'd be back as soon as I was. And I turned the TV on, and it says 700,000 people downtown LA marching in the first Women's March, the first march last year. So this crazy dichotomy of, we left at 81% approval rating, and then I get back to my home country, and you have millions of people around the country sort of out in the streets. It was a very 24 hours. It was a kind of this crazy whiplash of what was going on. So anyhow, I just wanted to give you kind of a snapshot of a little bit of my background history, what we focused on at the embassy. And again, that first year under a very difficult government that was basically not just anti-US. I kept telling Washington, don't take it personal. They're kind of anti-West. They're anti-Europe. They're anti-everybody, with the exception of, this was President Kirchner, with the exception of sort of Iran, Cuba, China, and Venezuela, which was not a good team to choose, I didn't think. So ultimately, I didn't think that was going to work out, which it didn't. But then they had a big election in Argentina, and it was the first time since the return of democracy in 1983 in Argentina that a single political party won the city, then the province, and the federal election, and it's a non-Peronist party, which, not a lot of people know a lot of details about Argentina, but the one thing many people do know, it's like, it's a Peronist country, and it's true, the majority probably are self-identified sort of preparedness, but then we could talk forever about what that actually means. But the fact that they had this huge election to change the direction of their country is a big deal. And then a few months ago, they had their midterm elections, which was in some ways, I wouldn't say a bigger deal, but maybe as important because it ratified the change that the public wants. Because usually the first midterm election, the new president does very poorly in most countries, including the United States. So we'll see what happens this year. But in spite of doing really tough things the first 2 years in Argentina, the government won seats, and they won a bunch of seats, which is really rare. I mean, they had to kind of correct the imbalances in the economy, kind of had to normalize. They're still working on it. It's not perfect, but they're going the right direction. They had to increase electricity rates like 300 to 400%. They had to increase the costs of travel, of gas, of water. You know, when you do these things, you usually lose the next election because they're unpopular, but they're trying to straighten out the economy. The fact that the public came out and really voted in waves for them in spite of these tough things, I think is a really credit to the Argentine public for having a long-term vision to normalize the country. So anyhow, I'm back in the private sector. I'm living in Argentina half the time, in Puerto Madero, those who know it, and then half time in the States, mostly in the LA area. So thank you all for coming out. This is a lot more people than initially thought we would do, but that's very cool. And thank you for the introduction, guys, and for the association. I'm really glad you're doing this. So Andres, we're going to ask some really easy questions, right?
So my first question, or the question I thought initially was, you sort of touched a little bit, it was about, you were basically in the last 3 years when you started as an ambassador to Argentina, the Kirchner was the president, then it was a year after, then Macri became the president, so a big change, you really mentioned a little bit of it. And now 1 year later, we have a new president, but now in this part, in the north part of the country.
I've heard that, yeah.
So how these 3 years have changed, especially maybe the last one, since you already spoke a little bit about the first one, in terms of what are the consequences for the bilateral trade between the United States and Argentina?
It's a really good question, and because we had, I think, built up so many positive developments and momentum over the last half of my time, right, with President Macri and President Obama, who I didn't mention, he came down for a state visit to Argentina, right, which was a huge success. There was a lot of concern of how do we keep this going, and my answer, which was frankly more I was more hopeful than it was factual, but it was like, look, we've created so much positive momentum, and we try to institutionalize so many things across all the different departments and agencies and ministries that there was no reason for that to change. Just because we have a new U.S. administration, ultimately, if things are going well between both countries, you always have disputes. Hopefully you can minimize those disputes, mitigate them, through negotiation, but I didn't think there was any reason for that to change. In addition, there's just my opinion, but I think President Trump, his foreign policy is hard to describe, and it's probably more like, who do I know and who do I like? And he has known President Macri a little bit for a long time, because President Macri's father was a business guy in the development of real estate, so they knew each other a little bit, which I thought was going to be helpful ultimately on the bilateral relationship.
Yeah. Excellent, wonderful. So about a century ago or so, Argentina was known as the 7th largest economy in the world, and especially
Andres
because
is Argentine, by the way. I don't know if you know this, but
it was known as the barn of the world because of its competitive advantage in terms of agriculture. And recently, we have a big discovery of lithium reserves in the northern east part of the country.
Yeah.
And given the trend on sustainability and electric cars and so many electrical equipments we use today, maybe Argentina has the potential to become, the battery of the world, right? So, what does, in your opinion, and being there, what does Argentina needs to do to really make that a reality, and how Americans and American businesses can take advantage of that, or what should they do to be able to?
So during the presidential campaign in Argentina, Macri, who was the mayor of Buenos Aires, he had this saying, which I thought was pretty good. He said, look, in Chile, there's 54 mining companies in Chile that are operating, and I think there were 4 that were operating in Argentina, and Macri said, God did not put all the minerals on one side of the Andes. And he said, so we've got to do a much better job of being business friendly when it comes to mining and agriculture, what you talked about, agriculture in Argentina. One of the reasons why we've sort of had a little bit of competition over the years is because Argentina and the U.S. are both powerhouses when it comes to agriculture. So one of the first things he did was eliminate all taxes on exports of agriculture. And they've also done a lot in mining as to attract companies. But these are huge investments. And the ambassador from Canada is a good friend of mine, so a lot of Canadian mining companies have come down. Australian companies have come there as well. So right now, I think we're in the second phase, which is what I told President Macri, where it took about a year and a half for companies and investors to get just comfortable with the idea of investing in Argentina because they read 10 years of bad headlines. But now they're in the second phase, which are looking for specific deals with local partners. And I would say mining in particular, that's true. Funny story. So I'd worked with Tesla, as I mentioned, and so I called them up when I was ambassador. I'm like, look, I want to buy a car, a Tesla car. I'll be the first one in Argentina. There's literally no all-electric cars. And A, it would be cool, but B, I'll get you all this free press. It'll be on the front page, I guarantee you. And they were kind of going, hemming and hawing. I couldn't get an answer from them. And I'm like, what is the problem? Eventually, they told me the truth. They're like, well, look, we don't have a service center there. We don't have a sales team there. We get plenty of press, but if something goes wrong, it's much worse for us. So I kind of understood that. So there's still not electric cars there, but to your point, lithium coming out, I do think that's going to be ultimately one of the drivers of the economy. It's not yet because it's such a big investment, but I think in the coming years it will be.
Can Argentina do something to favor American businesses? Will they do that, you think, or not?
Yeah, right. So I had encouraged President Macri to go to New York a couple months ago, right after their midterm elections, which again were so surprising in a good way. And so one of the things that he kept talking about was, we want you, American companies, investors, family offices, funds to be in Argentina. Anything that my government can do, we will do. And so to that end, and we were talking about Amazon before we walked in this room, I'm trying to convince Amazon to come there on the web services side. So it's the cloud, basically. And they've decided now, of all the countries in Latin America, to put 3 huge data centers. They're like $200 million each. These big data centers. It'll either be in Argentina or Chile. So we've got them to the final decision. And so I do think you are starting to see big companies make those kind of decisions. Hopefully they end up going to Argentina. But just the fact that Argentina is a finalist is a big deal.
Right. When we took the last group of students to Argentina was in March, so before the midterm election, and one of our alums, who I'm sure you know it, Juan Procaccini, he's now basically selling Argentina around the world, right? And trying to bring investments. And one of the things he said, as you pointed out, is the midterm election was the big deal because that will sort of give investors some vote of confidence that Argentina was actually going in the right direction and was going back to the previous 12 years. However, I think compared to other countries in Latin America, such as Peru and Brazil, where we've seen that people who have been involved in different type of scandals are really being brought to justice and are in jail even then. Argentina seems to be very slow with the justice systems, and the rule of law doesn't seem to apply always or equally to everyone. In your experience, do American businesses are worried about that, and what do you think we can offer them, or how can Argentina do things differently to really probably or will lower that barrier of fear to go and do business in Argentina?
My experience is this government at the high level, not only are they very smart and worldly, many educated at universities around the U.S., but they're honest. And that's where you have to sort of start, have an honest government. And it's not everywhere, all around the country, but I'd say at the highest levels, at the federal level, that's what I believe. My experience has been that they're very honest. In terms of the last government, you see more and more people who, including ministers and secretaries, and the second and third one down, either going to jail over corruption and payoffs, or indicted, or they're going to spend a lot of time trying to stay out of jail. I do think that the justice within Argentina has gotten a lot stronger because, one of the things that Cristina did was really beat them down to the point where people fear. It was really not quite broken, but it was close. And I think now that you don't have a president every day beating on the press, that they're getting stronger. These institutions are getting stronger. So I do think there's change going on right now.
When you try to promote businesses, American businesses, to go to Argentina, was that a fear for Americans or not?
It really isn't. My personal experience is there's had some problems at customs, and the U.S. companies do not give bribes because of our own laws, right? So the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act forces U.S. companies not to do that. Otherwise, they put themselves at huge personal risk because of the U.S. laws. So I think most, or at least my experience has been, not just Argentina, but other countries, whether it's at the customs or at the port or somewhere else, a lot of times American companies don't even get asked because they know U.S. companies don't do it. If they do, they're really subject to huge, not only penalties and fines, but criminal prosecution in the United States. So this is one of the reasons why people want to work with us. They want to work with U.S. companies because they know in general that there isn't the kind of corruption like many companies around the world.
Interesting. Although limits the possibility to doing business, because sometimes in this country, at least it was in the past, right? So if you don't bribe, if you don't bribe, you don't go, right?
He's very skeptical.
You know?
Cynical on, it's like, one of the reasons they like me down there is because you got to be optimistic and hopeful, and you got to spot the change that's happening right now.
I want to be realistic, I guess following in that direction, since, Argentina is definitely a developing country, hopefully, soon will be developed, but it still is a developed country with a lot of its history on corruption and populist governments. From your experience, I know you put some programs in place, but maybe you can talk a little bit about how Argentina can help in challenging issues such as climate change or refugees or defense of human rights, what Argentina could do to help on those aspects.
So just one example of how important their election was. When President Macri came in, we had a delegation representing President Obama who couldn't be there, representing the United States. They came down there for all the official ceremony and kind of the pomp and circumstance. But the very first day, so that was Inauguration Day. So the very first day, I got a message that our team, the U.S. Negotiators in Paris for the climate accords, the UN climate accords, were dealing with Argentina, and Argentina was still being resistant like they were in the months leading up to it because that group had been appointed by the previous president. So they were still there, although there was a new Argentine president, and they had not changed their tone. And there was only 48 hours to go before the deadline, the end of the climate negotiation. So I didn't really want to do it, but I felt I had to do it. So I called the foreign minister. I'm like, I'm sorry, I know it's your first day at work, but there's only 48 hours left, and your people did not get the message that the new administration believes in climate change in Argentina, ironically. And Macri wants to do something about it and talked about having a very strong agreement in Paris. And the foreign minister, is Susana Malcora, who's great, said, okay, thanks for letting us know. We're just settling in. I'll get back to you. And that first day, they fired everybody in Paris. They left one. I don't know if the original guy was in there or not, but only one person spoke for them, and he used to be the head of a big environmental group in Argentina. And so literally they changed their whole position because they were like siding with the Saudis and the Chinese, basically against Europe and the US. And so they completely changed their position, and that got other countries on board too, because Argentina is big, a third largest economy in Latin America, third largest population. So when they do something, other countries notice, and especially smaller countries in the region. So that's a perfect example of that election was so important. And in day one, they completely changed 180 degrees their position on Paris, on the climate accord.
Interesting. One of the first things that President Macri did when he took office was to travel to China. And in searching for investments, and the Chinese offer about $16 billion of investments to Argentina. They promised, right? They said there's a rain of investments. Still, we have to see it coming, but hasn't really hit the country yet. But is it a competition between the U.S.? I mean, Argentina, China and the U.S. are the two big trading partners in addition to Brazil, to Argentina. So as an ambassador, do you see this as a competitor? Is more of a cooperation between there's opportunities to invest, but who takes this? Are you trying to really, or where are you trying to get to promote Americans to invest as opposed to letting those businesses go to China?
Yeah, I mean, part of the job of any ambassador is really to promote U.S. business, which increases our employment here in the U.S., right? And so with China, I was friendly and got to be pretty good friends with the ambassador from China to Argentina, so in Buenos Aires. But I also think of it as a friendly competition. I mean, it's no question there's a competition, and when they do not have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, for example, and so we've got to sometimes argue on the merits of our products and services, and win contracts. So part of it is public contracts, and the other is obviously private business-to-business deals and contracts. And I think the Argentines have a natural affinity to the U.S., and so, yeah, I mean, I look at it. If I was China, I'd be doing the same thing, is looking at places where the U.S. has either walked away or does not have a strong presence, and I would be there if I were them, and that's exactly what they're doing. So when the U.S. under Trump, and I know we wanted to open this up to not just Argentina, but when they walk away from trade agreements or they walk away from international responsibilities, whether it's China or Russia or other countries, will happily fill that vacuum. And so we've got to stay engaged. And when I talked about the terrible idea of cutting the State Department, that just gives an opportunity to other countries to have a bigger influence in places where we should have a big influence. So yeah, I think it is a zero-sum game in lots of ways. And so we've got to stay very engaged in places all around the world.
Excellent. One of the things that have pushed the economy in Argentina since its origin is the small businesses and the family businesses. And so we're talking about big, large investments, mine and all that. But has the bilateral trade between Argentina and the U.S. have really impacted the small businesses in Argentina or the small business in the U.S.? And have you created any programs around that area?
So what's really interesting is that there's less public companies in Argentina today than 30 years ago, which is hard to sort of fathom. But the reality is, part of that is the up and down cycles they've had over the last 100 years, more or less. So for those who don't follow that, every 10 years it seems, again, more or less, there's a peak and there's a valley, and they go through these crises. But this new government there talks about it honestly all the time. They say, look, we need slow growth. We need to get out of this cycle. So I think it's important because when you have stability and you have slow growth, I think family companies are more open to the idea, obviously bigger family companies, to potentially going public or potentially working with a foreign company, a merger or acquisition. But when you have these cycles, they decide to close their books. And also you have to worry about how much is on the black market versus how much is legal. So later this year, and since we're at the business school, it's important to note that MSCI is going to change the rating, most likely, everybody assumes, for Argentina from frontier market, which is crazy. They're in the frontier. That's like Angola and I don't know what other countries, to emerging market, which is where they should be. And so when that happens, you have the index funds. So Fidelity and BlackRock, it's emerging market index funds that are going to have to buy a lot more stock from Argentine companies. And they usually list out of New York, ADRs out of New York, but nonetheless, the point is there's a huge need for more public companies. But to your point, Andres, those public companies come from usually family-owned companies, and are the books good enough and so all these big families that I know are saying, look, if I were you to ride this wave when MSCI changes this in probably July, I would get all the ducks in a row, get ready to go public. Some do, some don't. But I do think you're going to see an increase in IPOs in Argentina in the next 12 to 18 months.
Interesting. One of the talks that we have with one of the headhunters in Argentina, when I bring a group of students to Argentina, when I take a group of students to Argentina, is about why will American and expat, management, since we are in the management school, and maybe some of this will go back and when I go back and be a manager in Argentina, what are the challenges that American or international managers face trying to run companies in Argentina? What are the biggest difficulties they face when they're trying to adjust maybe to the culture, or what are the business culture challenges, what are the the cycles of the business that are more different there than in here, and what are the struggles that they have?
Number one is inflation. Every country president of a U.S. company, they're pretty much all Argentines. I think for a couple of reasons, but one of them is they're used to the economy. They're used to sort of the quote unquote craziness, which this government's trying to iron out. And so they all tell me they're on these conference calls to their home offices that are like, wait, we have to increase salaries 42%? Like, wait, how is that possible? And they have to go through the whole thing and why it makes sense. And so inflation, I think, for international companies, for the home offices, is hard for them to really wrap their heads around. And the local offices, they understand it, they live with it. I think President Macri is truly committed to bringing down inflation. They'd like it to go faster, but all these things are tied together because they need to have investments in infrastructure and energy especially. And so when they increase the price of energy, it's hard to bring inflation down, so it's all tied together. But ultimately, it's basically half of what it was at its peak when I was there. So it's low 20s, let's say. Yeah. And they really are trying hard to get it to, they say single digits, which for Argentina is like 9.99, which is like zero for them. I mean, it's just, so I think they're trying hard to do that. Right. But I would say that's like the number one thing. Real estate prices. So I hosted Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan, largest bank in the world, and he's another one who, his country president, who's a great guy and a good friend of mine, so he's Argentine, he runs JP in Argentina. He flew to try to convince Jamie Dimon to open up their research office for Western Hemisphere in Buenos Aires. This was like 2 years ago. And Jamie Dimon says, why would I do that? All I've read is 10 years of bad headlines. It's crazy there. And so over an hour, though, Facundo convinced him basically because of the human talent that's there. They have a very good educational system. You have people coming out of universities, not all are like UCLA, but they have really good universities there. And it's only 1 hour difference to the East Coast. So there's various reasons why. Eventually, to their credit, they decide, okay, we'll open an office, 1,500 people. And these are good jobs. These are research positions. And they serve basically their clients in New York. So if you're a JP Morgan Chase client and you want information on Microsoft, that information gets researched out of Buenos Aires now and then gets sent to New York. He told me recently they could potentially do another 1,500, except for they can't find enough real estate. They can't find enough commercial space. Again, the lack of investment over the last 10 years is really dramatic. So that's part of the problem. And then I think it also applies to residences. It costs a lot to live there, usually because of the rent. And the last thing is there's really no mortgages. It's starting to be created. Americans are like, that's crazy. You have to show up with 100% cash and dollars. That is changing, and I think pretty dramatically as a percentage. Still, the numbers are still small, but you're starting to see big growth. Right. So if you guys can figure out mortgages in Argentina, you'll be billionaires. But do you want to open it up to Q&A?
Yeah, definitely.
So Argentina has historically had a very relatively wealthy and educated population. So why is their government so bad?
There are endless amount of books about this, and they have asados, which are like barbecues, and I think the number one topic is this. And to my Argentine friends, and I try not to say this publicly because I didn't want people to get the wrong idea, but I said, look, your number one attraction is a cemetery in Buenos Aires. The simile is you guys are looking backwards. We need to look forward. So I went to this dinner, and as ambassador, you get invited to all these dinners at people's houses. And Mirta Legrand was there, who's like the Oprah of television. She's been on TV for like 70 years. And I'm sitting next to her, and there's this whole discussion. It's like 10 people about what went wrong, what the definition of Peronism is, because everybody has a different definition, and it's really a power structure. It's not like a set of beliefs, I think. Anyhow, after about 45 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. And I just said, hold on. I said, I just read an article that in California, that we went over, so this was a while ago, we went over 300,000 all-electric cars just in California. I said in Los Angeles, my hometown, I'm telling this at the dinner party, yeah? And in Los Angeles, half the energy comes now from solar and wind. I've got solar panels at my house in Palm Springs. I sell it back to the grid. I actually make money. And so I say this stuff, right? And then I'm trying to change the conversation. And then after like 5 minutes, somebody like goes, well, I have a different definition of parentism. I want to, I said, oh God, okay. So it is hard, but I do think that it has changed in some ways over the last couple of years. And that's why this last election was so important, because Macri doesn't focus on that. His cabinet doesn't focus on that. They really try to focus on the future. I'm not saying they're perfect and they make some mistakes, but it's still a challenge. I mean, there's still big challenges. They had big protests there in December, which is also kind of a natural thing, I think, for Buenos Aires. But I at least tried to talk a lot about renewable energy. I used a lot of California and LA examples. I talked about UCLA. I think this is right, like trying to get off the grid, basically, and the reclamation of water, if that's the right word, that you guys are doing. And like, I try to use all these examples. So my friends give me a hard time. Sometimes they said I was the ambassador from California and I'm the ambassador of the United States. But I do think that is a challenge. That's more cultural. It's like a cultural challenge, I think, more than anything. But I don't know why I want to bring this up, but the third largest book fair in the world is in Buenos Aires. They have more bookstores than anywhere else. But if you go by, it's really interesting to see what people are reading. And I literally have noticed a little bit of a change from looking in the past to the future. You know, when there's like Elon Musk autobiography in the window, and I'm like, okay, that's good. So we're talking now about the future and not always about the past. It takes time. And so people get frustrated there, but I'm like, look, you're going the right direction. You just have to give it some more time. Good question.
I remember reading a statistic while I was down there in Buenos Aires that, and I won't remember the numbers exactly, but approximately equal to 1/3 of the country's annual GDP was being held in private hands by Argentines outside of Argentina. So they were keeping the bulk of their money, their salaries, their investments outside of Argentina. And that shows there's a lack of confidence among Argentines themselves and their own economy. Obviously, they know the history better than anybody else. They've seen the peaks and valleys. They've seen the government wipe out their bank accounts, either through inflation or just by grabbing it. But if you don't have Argentines believing in their own future because they're keeping their money overseas, they're investing in the US and Miami or maybe in Europe, then that's not going to be a good sign for US companies to want to go down and invest in Argentina. Have you seen, is there a trend, is there a turnaround, or Argentines taking some of their billions of dollars that they have held in overseas bank accounts and starting to reinvest it back in Argentina?
Short answer is yes, but to Derek's point, so about, let's see, timelines. About a year and a half ago, I guess, they announced, the blanqueo, which was, in English, it's
amnesty.
It's like a tax amnesty. And so they said, all right, well, if you declare your assets overseas, these are legal assets, but people, they park them in banks overseas because of what Derek said about the worrying about will it be taken, the economy, inflation, all this stuff. So the amnesty said, look, if you declare your assets overseas, you pay a one-time like 10% penalty by December 31st of last year, so a little bit over a year ago. Everything's cool. You can bring it back. You can move it anytime. And we at the U.S. Embassy actually played, I think, a pretty big role because nobody really knew how much was going to get declared. And then because of the good people who worked at the embassy in our econ department, and same with the people in Washington at the Department of Treasury, I mean, they like broke their back to get this agreement done where the Department of Treasury was working with their IRS, basically called AFIP, and that we would do information sharing of banks. Basically, so the U.S. Department of Treasury was working with the banks in the U.S. to say, hey, if you guys in Argentina audit an Argentine, we will work with you and give you the information. That changed everything. That happened the week before the end of the year. And in that 1 week, something like $60 to $70 billion was declared in 1 week. Because everybody's like, uh-oh. Like, I got a lot of money in Miami and New York, and I got to declare now. Ultimately, it was $130 billion that was declared the most successful tax amnesty in history. And I think like $8-9 billion of penalties went into the government, so that was good. And now this money you can move. much more easily. And so we are seeing that mostly in real estate. It's the easiest thing, and Argentines love to invest something they could feel and touch. And so brick and mortars, and that's just why real estate prices, both on commercial and residential, are I wouldn't say skyrocketing, but are increasing pretty dramatically because people want to bring some money back, and it's hard to figure out where to invest it quickly, except for let's buy some more apartments. So I live in this place called Puerto Madero, and you look, and there's not many lights on at night, but it's like land banking. They buy like 1, 2, 3 apartments sometimes. And so we got to find other places to put it. And then in December, just a month ago, they changed these laws on the capital markets and making it easier to invest into the stock market. So again, it's a process of changing. But right now, it's mostly real estate. And I look at it, so there's a huge opportunity for them. I said that publicly a lot. I said, look, you all talk about encouraging foreign direct investment. Andres asked about American companies, investors, and that's what I'm doing. But I always said, look, you can't expect foreigners to invest if you're not investing in your own country. You guys know more about your country than anybody else. So if you go to Silicon Valley or LA and you say, hey, I have a project here, they're like, okay, but what are the Argentines doing? Are they investing in it? Because if they're not, I won't. I mean, I think that's a smart thing to do. I think that is changing, and that needs to continue to change. It's really important.
What do you think is Argentina's entrepreneurial competitive edge? What should we highlight when we go up against investors?
So in Latin America, there's 6, they call it unicorns, right? I mean, started from scratch. They're billion-dollar companies now. In all of Latin America, there's only 6. 4 of the 6 came from Buenos Aires. That's really unique. Endeavor, which I don't know, many of you may know, it's I don't know how you describe it. It's a tech entrepreneur association, I guess. Really strong. It started in Buenos Aires. Really, really strong. Technology, for sure, is a big deal. And we were talking about many or most, right? Most of the graduates coming out of Anderson, you say, are going into tech in some fashion. So Buenos Aires has a booming tech scene and continues. I think one of the reasons is they didn't have to rely on machinery coming in, right? So import-export was always really tough, especially the last decade, let's say. And their market is the world. It's not Argentine specific, and so it's not captive to the cycles of the economy. So you don't really need a lot of product. You need brain power and you need computers, and they have that. So I'd say technology for sure. Energy, especially renewable, is booming. Since I was here last with that group from Argentina, I brought 30 Argentines to California a year and a half ago. I lose track of all this stuff. And 10 from the government, 20 from the private sector. One of the guys from the government was a secretary of renewable energy. He was on this trip. He had to keep leaving because he was negotiating with the World Bank and the IMF they were like the safety net for investors because they knew investors, maybe didn't trust the long-term contracts. And so they built this whole system around that. So there's 4 ways to get your money back, basically, and the World Bank was the last backstop. And so there was a huge push of investors around the world. And when I got there, less than 1% of the energy was coming from renewables, in spite of the fact that they have literally the best wind in the world in terms of consistent wind in Patagonia in the south of Argentina, and some of the best wind in the world in the north. So they should be all over renewables, less than 1%. And I said, LA is like 50% now. And so that was 3 years ago. Today, they're like closing in on 7%, so 700 times more, I think. And they're going to get to 20% by 2020 is the goal. So, we'll see. But those I'd say are 2 areas for sure. I mentioned real estate for sure is a big area. Manufacturing's still tough. I mean, it's still, and they're worried about their own economy. So on textiles, if they open it up for clothing and stuff, like it will, I think, and they think, like kill their industry. So they're going slow, especially on textiles. That's why all the Argentines go to Miami or Santiago and they load up with clothes and other things, TVs and other things. And so that's got to change because they've got to increase be more competitive and efficiency, productivity. These are like obviously, buzzwords, but those are key to their economy. And they know it. It takes some time.
There's also a big change that the Macri governments have done to change the law to make opening new startups much faster. in the last year or so. We visited a bunch of startups. There's a lot of investors in incubators too, and Americans are also investing on, bringing funds to invest in startups. So that's happening there.
Absolutely. Accelerators are a big deal. Maker spaces now are starting to pop up. Actually, we're talking about Bullrich, right? We're talking about Minister Bullrich, who's the education minister, and then ran for Senate and beat Christina Kirchner in basically where it should be her base. And he was the first one to tell me about Singularity University. Can you raise your hand if you know of Singularity University? Do you guys know about this? I didn't even know about it. If you don't know about it, check it out. It's in Northern California at Ames Research Facility near Stanford.
I thought you were supposed to promote UCLA, no another university.
But it's not UCLA, but it's really cool. And so this Minister Bullrich was telling me about Singularity University, which is in California. I'd never heard of it. And he wanted to bring 30, basically like a branch model, and bring 30 of them around Argentina to Argentina, which was really ambitious. He still wants to do it. I talked to him a lot. They've come down there now a number of times. And so when you're talking about tech and Silicon Valley, obviously LA, I keep talking about Silicon Beach so they understand what's happening here. So I think all of those areas are great areas. Those will grow, and I think dramatically.
I know you worked under Kirchner first and then Macri, and in a lot of academic circles, Kirchner is actually a little bit more popular, just in terms of human rights movements. She wrote part of an educational module that the grandmothers or las abuelas use, and I was just curious if it's just possibly a political rhetoric, but Macri is usually painted as less of an advocate for human rights, which actually could affect business if you're looking at it in terms of, we go in and not just corruption, but other policies. So what were your observations, perhaps, when you were there?
So I'm not ambassador anymore, so I could say,
Yeah.
I think she liked to wrap herself in that flag of human rights. I have no idea if she believed it or not. Maybe. Let's just give her the benefit of the doubt. I do think some of the organizations, I won't say all of them, are political organizations. I mean, and I don't quite know if some of the student organizations realize it, that they are hardcore political organizations. And I got lots of examples of how I know that, but they also get paid a lot, some of them, from the last government. So, look, nobody's pure in politics, I would say, right? So I'm not casting. I do think that he gets a bad rap about that, Macri. Again, nothing's perfect, and everybody, can do better on certain things. But I do think there's a lot of politics around it, and so I would just read about the stuff and view it. I'll be a little Argentine skeptically on some of the stuff, I was there. So when President Obama came down, we went to the memorial with President Macri, and they both spoke to it was the memorial to the victims of the dirty war from 76 to 83. And it was really emotional. It was very moving. Both, if you haven't seen but it's on YouTube. Both those speeches are incredible. It was very hard to get even representation of any of those organizations, and which was a real shame. And we really tried hard. And so, anyhow, I do think there's some for sure that are really true believers and doing great work. And we actually in the embassy, that's a big deal for us as human rights. And there's actually a division that I think, didn't Trump eliminate? I think they did. I think Tillerson eliminated it in the State Department a few months ago on human rights, or at least cut it just in a huge way. So for the U.S., it's a very big deal. Argentina, is doing pretty well on that score, I think, relative to many countries around the world.
Thank you, Noah.
No,
thank you so much.
Good questions.
I have a little gift as a token of appreciation. Amigo Fernandez, I have one more question. Boca or River?
So these are the two soccer clubs there, and I realized, this, and I always said, look, at UCLA and USC is a pretty big rivalry. It's nothing like Boca and River. And so my diplomatic answer was, well, I learned that it's more dangerous to talk about soccer than politics in Argentina. But then I started saying, but I really like to watch a game at La Bombonera, which is where Boca plays. So everybody kind of knew I was for Boca. So.
And those are the colors of UCLA, right?
Exactly.
So that's good. That's
exactly.
good. Yeah?
Exactly. Andres,
Thank you
you
so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you, everyone.